If you pulled up a photograph of Buenos Aires today, you would see a city that looks almost indistinguishable from Madrid or Lisbon. Pale faces, European architecture, Spanish surnames. Argentina presents itself to the world as a white country. Its politicians have said so. Its textbooks have implied it. And for most of the 20th century, the rest of the world simply accepted it. But in 1778, the Spanish colonial government conducted a census of Argentina. The numbers it recorded do not match the image Argentina has spent 2 centuries constructing. At that moment, black people made up 37% of the entire Argentine population. In Buenos Aires, the capital, the figure was closer to 30%. These were not marginal communities living at the edges of society. They were a foundational part of it. By 2025, that figure had collapsed to somewhere between 1 and 2%. No war produces numbers like that. No epidemic alone explains it. No migration pattern accounts for a disappearance so total. What happened to Black Argentina is not a mystery of history. It is a story of policy, ideology, and deliberate erasure, and the DNA evidence now makes it impossible to deny. To understand what was lost, you have to first understand what existed. And what existed in 18th century Argentina was not a minority population clinging to the margins. It was a thriving, numerically significant community woven into the fabric of colonial life. The 1778 census is the clearest window we have into that reality. Conducted by Spanish colonial administrators across the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, it recorded black and mixed-race people at 37% of the total Argentine population. In the province of Córdoba, the figure reached as high as 44%. In Santiago del Estero, higher still. These were not isolated pockets. These were concentrations spread across the country's most populated and economically active regions. In Buenos Aires itself, roughly 1 in 3 residents was black. They worked the ports, the tanneries, the bakeries, the domestic households of the colonial elite. They built the infrastructure of a city that would one day call itself European. They also built something else entirely, their own. Mutual aid societies called naciones, organized along African ethnic lines, gave Black Argentines a parallel civic structure. The naciones held dances, settled disputes, raised funds to purchase the freedom of enslaved members, and maintained cultural traditions that traced directly back to Angola, Congo, Senegal, and beyond. The popular tango, the musical form most associated with Argentine identity globally, carries direct rhythmic and structural roots in African musical traditions brought to the Rio de la Plata through this very community. Argentina's most celebrated cultural export is, in origin, partly African. This was not a footnote population. This was a majority in some regions, a near majority in others, and a culturally formative force across the whole country. What happened to them deserves more than a footnote answer. The story of Black Argentina does not begin in 1778. It begins 2 centuries earlier, in the 16th century, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in chains at the port of Buenos Aires. The city had barely been founded. Its streets were unpaved. Its economy was undefined, but the demand for forced labor was immediate, and the transatlantic slave trade moved quickly to meet it. By the early 1600s, the slave trade had become the dominant commercial activity in Buenos Aires. Contemporary records indicate that roughly 70% of all trade passing through the port involved the importation of enslaved Africans. This was not incidental commerce. This was the engine of the colonial economy. Enslaved people were the currency through which Buenos Aires grew, the labor through which its buildings rose, and the mechanism through which its ruling class accumulated wealth. The trade operated through a licensing system called the asiento, granted by the Spanish crown to foreign merchants, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British, who were authorized to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Buenos Aires sat at a critical node in this network. Ships arriving from Angola, from the Congo coast, from Mozambique, unloaded human cargo that was then distributed inland to the mines of Potosi and the farms of the interior. The slave trade was formally abolished in Argentina in 1813. Slavery itself lasted another 40 years, finally ending in 1853. For nearly 3 centuries, the forced migration of African people had been the primary demographic force shaping the Argentine population. When historians speak of Argentina's black community appearing suddenly in the census records of the 18th century, they are missing the point. That community was not sudden. It had been built deliberately, systematically, and profitably over generations. When Argentines have been pressed to explain where their black population went, the most common answer has always been the wars. The Argentine War of Independence, which began in 1810 and ended in 1816. The War of the Triple Alliance against Paraguay, which ran from 1864 to 1870. Yellow fever, cholera, conflict after conflict. The standard narrative holds that black men died disproportionately in these wars, and the population simply never recovered. There is a kernel of truth inside this answer, and that kernel has been stretched far beyond what the evidence supports. Black men were conscripted into the Argentine military at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population. They were placed in frontline battalions, given the most dangerous assignments, and offered freedom from slavery in exchange for military service. Many took that offer, many died. Maria Remedios del Valle, an Afro-Argentine woman who fought alongside her husband and sons in the Independence War, became one of the most decorated soldiers of that conflict, later honored by the Argentine legislature with a national day in her name. Her story is extraordinary precisely because it survived erasure. Most did not. But here is the problem with the war explanation. When slavery was abolished in 1853, black people still constituted roughly 1/3 of the Argentine population. The wars had already happened. The casualties had already been absorbed. And still, 1 in 3 Argentines was black. For the population to drop from 1/3 to near zero over the following decades, something far more systematic than battlefield casualties would have been required. Wars reduce populations. They do not erase entire demographic categories from a national census. The war narrative is not wrong. It is simply, and perhaps conveniently, incomplete. After the wars, something strange happened in the official record. Black Argentines began disappearing from the census, not just from the streets, but from the paperwork. The Argentine government conducted national counts in 1869 and again in 1895. In both, the methodology for recording race shifted in ways that made black and mixed-race populations systematically harder to count and easier to erase on paper before the erasure happened in reality. The 1,869 census recorded racial categories in ways that collapsed distinctions. Mixed-race individuals who might previously have been counted as black or mulatto were increasingly recorded simply as Argentine. The effect was not accidental. A population that had been 1/3 of the country in 1853 appeared, by the late 19th century, to have shrunk to statistical insignificance. Whether this reflected actual demographic collapse or bureaucratic reclassification is a question the numbers alone cannot answer. Almost certainly, it was both. The gender imbalance created by wartime casualties deepened the crisis. Black men had died at the front in disproportionate numbers. The community that remained was majority female. Black women faced a stark and structurally enforced choice: remain within the black community, which was shrinking, economically marginalized, and socially invisible to the state, or form relationships with non-black men, primarily European immigrants arriving in increasing numbers, and watch their children be classified as something other than black in the records that mattered. Many made the second choice. Not freely, but under conditions that made the first choice increasingly unlivable. What the government did not count, it could claim did not exist. And what it claimed did not exist, it had no obligation to protect, educate, or include. The census was not merely a measurement tool. In Argentina, it became an instrument of disappearance. What happened to Black Argentina was not simply the accumulation of tragic circumstance. At its core was an ideology. It had a name. Argentines called it blanqueamiento, whitening. And it was not a fringe belief held by extremists on the margins of society. It was government policy, intellectually defended, constitutionally enabled, and socially enforced across generations. The logic of blanqueamiento rested on a racial hierarchy that placed European whiteness at the apex of civilization and blackness at its opposite. Its proponents argued that Argentina's future prosperity depended on moving the population's composition as far toward European as possible. This was not spoken in whispers. It was written in newspapers, debated in legislatures, and promoted by some of the most celebrated intellectual figures of 19th century Argentine society. Juan Bautista Alberti, one of the architects of the 1853 Constitution, wrote explicitly that to govern is to populate, by which he meant to populate with Europeans. In practice, blanqueamiento operated through incentive and deprivation simultaneously. Interracial marriage was not legally prohibited, but the social and economic rewards of producing lighter-skinned children were unmistakable. White Argentines had access to universities, hospitals, skilled employment, and legal protections that Black Argentines were systematically denied. The message transmitted across generations was not subtle. Whiteness was survival, blackness was exposure. Initially, the concept of whitening was framed around culture and attitude rather than skin tone alone, but the distinction made little practical difference. Both framings pointed toward the same conclusion. Black identity, Black culture, and Black ancestry were problems to be diluted out of existence across successive generations. Blanqueamiento was not a conspiracy hatched in secret. It was an aspiration declared in public. And Argentina pursued it with the patience and consistency of a long-term national project. The ideological framework of blanqueamiento required a practical mechanism. It found one in the form of mass European immigration, engineered at the constitutional level and sustained for decades with the full institutional weight of the Argentine state behind it. The 1853 Constitution, the same document that abolished slavery, contained within it Article 25, which guaranteed unrestricted entry to immigrants from any nation. In theory, this was neutral. In practice, the Argentine government directed its recruitment efforts almost exclusively toward Europe. Agents were dispatched to Italy, Spain, Germany, and Eastern Europe with promises of land, subsidized passage, and economic opportunity. Between 1880 and 1930, roughly 4 million Europeans arrived in Argentina. 2/3 of the modern Argentine population traces its ancestry to that wave. The timing was not coincidental, as the Black population was already contracting through war casualties, disease, and census reclassification. The government moved to flood the demographic space with European arrivals. The arithmetic was straightforward. More white immigrants meant a faster path to a whiter country. The Black share of the population would shrink not only in absolute terms, but as a proportion of a rapidly expanding total. What resulted was a new mixed population, children of European fathers and Argentine mothers of various ancestries, who were officially categorized not as Black, not as mixed, but simply as Argentine. The African component in their bloodlines was administratively invisible. They were folded into the white Argentina that was being constructed around them. Before I show you what the DNA found buried inside that white Argentina, if you want to trace where Afro-Argentine ancestry fits into your own bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 2, 3, and Me tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Argentina spent 2 centuries constructing a white identity. Then genetic testing arrived, and the construction began to crack. Modern consumer DNA testing, combined with academic population genetics studies, has produced results that directly contradict the official demographic narrative Argentina built around itself. When researchers began analyzing the genomes of self-identified white Argentines, they found something the census records had spent generations concealing: African ancestry, measurable, traceable, and widespread, running through a population that had been told it had none. A landmark study published in the journal PLOS ONE analyzed the genetic composition of the Argentine population using autosomal DNA markers. It found that the average Argentine genome carries approximately 2.5% African ancestry. That figure sounds small until you scale it. Across a country of 46 million people, it represents a genetic signal distributed through tens of millions of individuals who largely have no idea it is there. In certain provinces, particularly in the Northwest and in Buenos Aires, the African component runs measurably higher. The African haplogroups present in Argentine genomes trace primarily to West and Central Africa, consistent with the documented origins of enslaved people brought to the Rio de la Plata between the 16th and 19th centuries. The genetic fingerprint matches the history precisely: Angola, Congo, Senegal. The same regions that supplied the slave ships that built Buenos Aires are the regions whose DNA now sits, unacknowledged, inside millions of Argentine genomes. What the DNA reveals is not that Black Argentines disappeared, it is that they were absorbed. Their descendants are present. They are counted in the census as white. They vote, work, and identify as European Argentine, but their genomes carry a record that no ideology, no immigration policy, and no census methodology was ever able to fully overwrite. The biology held on even when the history did not. Alongside the deliberate mechanisms of whitening, a set of structural conditions operated with quieter devastation on the Black Argentine community. They were not policies in the explicit sense. They were the consequences of exclusion, and their body count was enormous. In 1864, cholera swept through Buenos Aires. In 1871, yellow fever followed, killing an estimated 13% of the city's population in a single outbreak. These epidemics did not strike equally. They concentrated their lethality in the densely populated, poorly sanitized neighborhoods where Black Argentines lived. The same neighborhoods that received no municipal investment, no clean water infrastructure, and no meaningful medical attention from a government that had already decided their residents were not central to the national project. Black Argentines had no meaningful access to healthcare before emancipation in 1853, and access improved only marginally afterward. Infant mortality rates in Black communities ran significantly higher than in white ones. Black children attended school for fewer years than white children, not because of legal prohibition alone, but because poverty, domestic labor demands, and the absence of schools in their neighborhoods made sustained education structurally impossible for most families. The cumulative effect of these conditions was a community that was simultaneously losing members to disease, losing ground economically, losing children to infant mortality at accelerated rates, and being offered no institutional pathway out. When historians calculate the decline of the Black Argentine population in the second half of the 19th century, they sometimes treat the epidemics as separate from the whitening project. They were not separate. A government committed to blanqueamiento had every incentive to direct resources toward the communities it wanted to grow and away from the communities it wanted to diminish. Neglect, at sufficient scale and duration, produces the same result as more deliberate forms of erasure. There is a form of erasure that operates below the level of policy and above the level of individual choice. It works through the slow, generational dismantling of identity itself. Not the elimination of people, but the elimination of the consciousness that connects people to who they are and where they come from. This is what happened to Black Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it may be the most complete form of disappearance the country achieved. Interracial marriage, driven by gender imbalance, economic necessity, and the structured rewards of proximity to whiteness, produced children who occupied an ambiguous social position. Lighter skinned than their Black parent, they were granted access to institutions and opportunities that had been closed to the generation before them. But that access came with an unspoken condition. To claim the benefits of whiteness, you had to claim whiteness. You had to stop being Black, not just in appearance, but in self-identification, in cultural practice, in the stories you told your children about where the family came from. Across 2 or 3 generations, the African roots of millions of Argentine families were not forgotten so much as deliberately set aside. Grandmothers who remembered the Naciones, the African mutual aid societies, did not always pass those memories forward. The memories carried risk. Blackness carried risk. Whiteness, however partial and however performed, carried safety. The result is a country where, today, roughly 90% of the population identifies as white or European, where the African contribution to tango is rarely taught in Argentine schools, where the name Maria Remedios del Valle, the black woman who fought for Argentine independence, remained obscure for nearly 2 centuries. Identity erasure does not require violence at every step. It requires only that each generation finds it safer to forget than to remember. History suppressed does not stay suppressed indefinitely. At some point, the archive pushes back. In Argentina, that pushback began slowly in the 20th century and has accelerated into the 21st, driven by a generation of Afro-Argentine activists, scholars, and community organizers who decided that what was written out of history could be written back in. The reemergence began with documentation. Afro-Argentine community organizations started collecting oral histories, tracing family genealogies, and connecting the lived experiences of Black Argentines to the broader historical record that official narratives had omitted. They found, consistently, that the erasure had been thorough, but not total. Pockets of Black cultural memory had survived in the Northwest provinces, in the Candombe musical traditions that traced directly to Uruguayan and Argentine African communities, and in family stories that had been passed quietly from parent to child without the endorsement of any textbook. The legislative recognition of Maria Remedios del Valle was a watershed moment. In 2013, the Argentine Congress designated November 8th, the anniversary of her death, as the National Day of Afro-Argentines and African Culture. For the first time, the state formally acknowledged that a black woman had fought and bled for Argentine independence, and that her story belonged in the national memory alongside the European heroes who had dominated it. The DNA evidence has added a dimension to this reckoning that no political declaration could provide. It is one thing to argue that Black Argentines existed and mattered. It is another to demonstrate, through genomic data, that their biological legacy persists inside the population that spent 2 centuries claiming they were gone. Every Argentine who submits a DNA sample and discovers African ancestry in their results is receiving a message the government spent generations trying to prevent them from hearing. The past was never as white as the history books insisted. Argentina built one of the most successful racial erasure projects in modern history. It did not require a single dramatic act. It required patience, a census methodology here, an immigration policy there, an epidemic left unaddressed, a generation of children taught to identify with the European half of their ancestry and quietly set aside the other. Brick by brick, across 2 centuries, a country that was 1/3 black told the world, and eventually itself, that it had always been white. But DNA does not negotiate with ideology. It does not respond to government policy or national mythology. It simply records. And what it has recorded inside millions of Argentine genomes is the biological signature of the people who built Buenos Aires, who fought for Argentine independence, who danced the earliest forms of what would become tango, and who were then written out of the story their own labor helped create. Black Argentina was never erased. It was renamed. It was reclassified. It was absorbed into a national identity that refused to acknowledge it. The genome held the truth that the history books discarded. And now, finally, the science is giving it back.
Thanks for watching this video, but before you go, don't let your DNA results just sit there unanswered. Tap the link on the description to download your ebook and find out what your raw data is hiding.